Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Hrůzová, and on behalf of the Fresh Eye platform for the study of visual culture, I would like to welcome you at the second edition of this year's 2021 of our online lecture series, which has been kindly supported by the State Cultural Fund of the Czech Republic. For those who meet the Fresh Eye for the first time, I would like to know that next to the online lecture series, we also organize public workshops for high schools and elementary students. We also organize conferences, educative workshops for wider audience, like teachers and university students, as well as we run a website where you can find our online database, as well as all the videos which archive our lecture series. Along with ArtMap, the informative platform based here in Prague, Czech Republic, and the documentary series Documentary Mondays, organized by the Cinema Světozor. We also run the film screenings, which are accompanied by the artistic introductory performances. More you can find on our website www.fresheye.cz or org. Tonight, I'm very happy that three interesting guests have participated or are going to participate, have welcomed our invitation for tonight's program, where we want to together explore and critically examine what does it mean, the queer and the queerness in the contemporary society as a social complex phenomena, as well as research, creative and artistic strategies. These three speakers have a very different professional background, which I do believe will lead to a very fruitful perspectives that we will get insight into. So the first speaker of tonight's evening will be a visual anthropologist based in Berlin, Sydney, and many other places, which we will learn from him. And it's Blake Paul Kendall, who is currently based at Hochschule für Medien und Wirtschaft in Berlin. Then we will welcome the second speaker of tonight's program, who is going to be Natálie Drtinová, an art critic currently collaborating as an editor of an art section of a bi-weekly cultural magazine A2, A2. And then the third speaker of tonight's program will be a cultural critic and a journalist, Ondřej Trhoň, who is collaborating with many interesting cultural platforms, but we can mention at least the broadcasting radio Wave, as well as an independent magazine zine, Deeped, and he's a main author of this interesting project. So this is the vision and the scenario for tonight's program, and I would like to address and to invite you to collaborate with us and to participate in this program through the chat, which you can find on YouTube, where you can post any questions addressed directly to our speakers, and I will be checking the chat regularly, so I will be able to be your voice and ask your question to our speakers. So this is the official start, and now let's begin with those three speakers and with these three interesting insights into the what does it mean queer and the queerness in contemporary society. So welcome Lakei Ki, aka Blake Paul Kendall, and much for collaborating with Fresh Eye, and also important for me to thank to our mutual friend Pavel Boretsky, who put us in touch and made this connection possible. So thank you, Pavel, and welcome, Blake. I'm very pleased to have you here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and yes, thank you, Pavel, for those introductions. It's a pleasure to be with all today. I have been well accustomed to being held a secret. It comes with the territory. A recently observed pattern was that the majority of my loves over this short life have been those who would not define themselves as being with me. Straight men, lesbian women, or men without labels to call them otherwise. Across this spectrum, I've had a diverse range of experiences. Let me begin this. Straight privilege is real and has been something that I have experienced firsthand. The straight passing dynamics of a heteronormative world. I remember I fell in love with a cis woman, and it was like a second coming out. When we were getting together, she told me people's response on hearing the news of our partnership. What? You're with Blake? Gay Blake? We were in Sydney, the pink dollar hub that spoke of Mardi Gras, and it must be amazing on the other side of the rainbow dreams. But I do acknowledge that it was in Sydney that I experienced the most homophobia of my life. For it felt that in these strange old suburbs, still grappling with beer belly myths of conquering the land, being a bloke, and asking, mate, what the fuck are you supposed to be? In these suburbs of grunt, the issues were still there, and as an inner response, the inner city suburbs became a hub of the LGBTIQ community. They were relatively small hubs, but with grand reputations. The story told out in such a Sydney side context that though I had been accepted and my sexuality celebrated, being bi was seen as a transition, straight to gay, journeying the spectrum from one end to the other. And so my LGBTI community had questions, doubts, and labels that required a second coming out. And when I was in a relationship with a cis woman, I was overwhelmed at all of the differences in how the world treated me. Most notably, I could not believe how many straight males came into my life. It were as if a girlfriend had suddenly given me a ticket into the boys' club. I'd never actually spent much time with the boys, and certainly not so many straight males in plural. I found it fascinating, and I found it even more fascinating, the dynamics and patterns of how we'd approach our time, and how time shared was positioned relatively to relationships had. Perhaps such a study could be an important anthropological pursuit, a research about straight male privilege and what the dynamic looks like, unraveling of patriarchy. So it was a strange dynamic, with suddenly seeing what the boys' club looks like. But I remember feeling very uncomfortable, whereby I was even held to question whether I was an imposter, a poser. Was I a gay man pretending to be straight? The strange thing about non-heteronormative sexualities is that everyone seems to have an opinion. I grew up in a schoolyard being told I was gay even before I felt sexual urges, or before I could feel that they were there. It is often to me that being non-hetero equates that our sexuality is the topic of everyone else's opinions. Everyone has an opinion or definition of our sexual practices. I remember when I was single and in my early 20s, I repeated a similar dialogue with the humble stranger. So, what is your sexuality? Are you gay or what? I'm bi. How does that work? Well, I'm not defined on who I'm attracted to. When I meet someone, I don't look at them with predefined clarity. When I meet someone, I'm open to the possibilities. I don't know whether they'll be a friend or a lover. I'm not sure what the relationship will be. I'm open. But which do you prefer? What do you mean? Do you prefer fish or salami? I'm vegetarian. No. Do you prefer sex with men or with women? How can I compare? Which one feels better? How can you compare loves? Every time you are with a different person, doesn't it feel different? Every love I have is different, no matter what their gender. At this point, the cis men would say, "You're so lucky, you've got double the amount of people to fuck." The homophobic souls would say, "Fair enough, you're a weird guy." And the cis straight women would say, "I could never be with a man who is with other men." Why, I would ask. "I don't know," they'd respond. "It's gross." It's hard to know whether this dialogue sits as a time capsule of 10 years ago. I spoke with a friend who has known me the last 10 years and who also migrated from sunny Sydney to Berlin. On reflecting on my own journey, she just kept saying, "But you can't say that now. Surely you can't say that anymore." A lot has changed in 10 years, but I'm not completely clear about what that is. Surely you can't say that anymore. Surely you can't say that anymore feels like a slogan of this contemporary zeitgeist. Questions of self-representation, political correctness, cultural appropriation, decolonization, tokenism, equal opportunities, liberation, and respect. A discourse of being more mindful of those components of who speaks. These very principles, questions, and dilemmas are core in the discipline of anthropology. Anthropology stemmed from colonialism and was its scientific apparatus to code otherness and define differences. It pivoted distance as a formality of observation and warranted collective classification in measuring culture. But anthropology has come a long way, and in many ways, it has provided itself with the tools of shift. When conducting an anthropological inquiry, the first step, as pre-described as research practice, is to do a literature review and define a theoretical position. Theory blurs in an applied practice and ethnographic encounters to look at that has been and what has been written before. From here, it's an opportunity to develop a methodological approach and develop the methods of fieldwork. What this means is that each new anthropology is responding to what has been done before. Literature review, and then develop a practice in response. It equates that the majority of the efforts actually focus deeply on methods and practices of research rather than subject. And constantly this is reflected in methodological innovation, aka asking how was research conducted on understanding the human and their culture. What worked? What can be developed? And how can we move forward? As a result, anthropology has had its crisis of representation back in the 1970s. It trickled into philosophy as postmodernity and into artistic scholarship as the active reader. This was the symptom of reflexivity, questioning positionality, and holding holding to light the ethics of researching with, as, and for the human. And of course, it's pluralized and heterogeneous with varying perspectives and approaches. There are still extremely problematic practices, and arguably the whole pursuit of knowledge for the great vault of academia is deeply problematic in itself. Never something that I like to practice. But so too, there are some interesting trends to reflect upon. These last few years, I've been teaching digital anthropology at Freie University and HKMW in Berlin. In the opening lecture, we are posed with a significant question of how do we define the human? In a digitized world that fluctuates between virtual and material worlds and fractured embodiments into hybrid forms, the very question of what constitutes the human is held to question. Fractured identities, users, avatars and profiles, online presence, the body behind the screen, artificial intelligence, AI chatbots, cyborgs and biomedically engineered, data deposits and digital natives, the non-human, the post-human, the transhuman, the fractured and the undefined. This is one pertinent question arising in digital anthropology. Who is the human? But so too it's reflecting in many interesting ways in other fields. Similarly, in what we would loosely be grouped as environmental scholarship, there are many efforts that have constituted a turning, focused on multi-species ethnographies, interspecies arrangements, entanglements beyond the body, and geomorphing the geological imprint of the earth as an extension of human intervention, now known as the Anthropocene. And with the great push to extend not only beyond the human, but so too beyond the discipline, the interdisciplinary arrangements with microbiologists now present the human as their own ecosystem, as an arrangement of microflora and bacterial colonies, the human as an extension of ecosystem, and the human as the ecosystem. It can be helpful to reflect on Donna Haraway and her work to fill this bridge. Having written the Cyborg Manifesto back in the 1980s, Haraway maintained this question of the shifting human across biological arrangements, most notably with the articulation of symbiosis. If Darwin managed to define a patriarchal mode of Cartesian dualism, aka modernity, employing classification and a rhetoric of competition as evolution's survival of the fittest, Haraway and many other ecofeminists propose symbiosis as a deep mechanism of life and its permeable membrane between the seemingly disparate, mutation, transformation, adaptation, and paralleling fields of exploring the human across different field sites was also a practice of Tom Bolstorff, who both proposed digital research on its own terms by being an avatar and engaging with other avatars in his 2007 monograph, Coming of Age Life, in which he details too the significance of having a paralleling practice of research. In his case, as he explored avatar and avatar relations in Second Life, so too he was researching the gay and lesbian communities in Jakarta, Indonesia. For me, this opens an important question of how to move beyond definitions, And I believe partly this comes in the form of challenging the process of classification. I'm reminded of a conversation I once heard by Angel Midoko, the New York-based queer Black Zen Buddhist priestess, who said queerness gave her the language of liberation. Queer as extending beyond gender and sexuality binaries and allowing a deeper complexion of the spectrum. This is the radical transition from the norms, but so too, queerness becomes its own norm. I remember in my first year of my bachelor's degree in writing and cultural studies at the University of Technology, Sydney, I wrote an article for a student paper, Vertigo. The article was titled Homo Rights as Human Rights, and it was a non-fiction essay about several examples of discrimination in the Australian media. It was 2007, and some of the cases included a war pensioner's rights denied as a gay man after his long-term partner died, as well as an inhumane treatment and denial of refugee status for a Sri Lankan man seeking asylum due to homophobic treatment in his homeland. When this article was published, the editors changed the title to Queer Rights as Human Rights. I was actually very upset because at that time, the term queer still carried a very negative connotation. The reclaiming of terms across identities is fascinating in its own right, as a phenomenon of resistance. Queer, faggot, pufta, I've heard them all, that when it comes from a straight person's mouth, feels different when it comes from someone else in the LGBTIQ community. I can probably attribute these shifts of becoming queer to a wonderful bunch of my friends, and particularly two of my besties, Marla and Prince. I think there's a reason why we stick together, why we often form these tribal alliances. It often means you don't have to explain yourself, and the entry point of what is common between us means that we don't have to say transphobia, homophobia, or patriarchy to blank faces. And so too, shared experience is hard on the family level. For many LGBTIQ people, the experience of exclusion happens in the family level and with loved ones. We often become each other's family because of experiences of rejection and not having our own. This is how we operate. This is how our communities are born. This is how the personal is political. And this is how I became queer and realized that being queer was political. Inclusivity for all who have been excluded. But a sour taste comes into my mouth when I speak with too much idealism. Are we liberated? Do we have a community? Are we one big happy family? On the 12th of June 2016, Pulse, the gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, was the site of a mass shooting, killing 49 souls and injuring 53 others. I remember hearing the tragedy of a dear friend, a Puerto Rican friend, who spoke of her loved ones that she lost on social media. All murder is tragic, but when it is targeted to a demographic, it takes on a more harrowing complexion. 11 days later, here in Berlin, was Berlin at the Pride March on Christopher Street Day. I remember being very overwhelmed with these shootings, and I was interested in doing a research about the concept of safe space and people's feelings of safety. The resulting ethnographic film, Our Safe Space, was a 30-minute experimental documentary that explored queer individuals' fears, vulnerabilities, but most pertinently, the finding exposed deeply important questions for me about community and about representations. As I did the interviews, something quite profound emerged. For the gay white cis males, the Orlando shooting did bring up questions of fear and concerns of safety. However, everyone's experiences were very different, as one trans friend and research participant shared in an interview. They did fear for their safety at Christopher Street Day, not because of the shooting at Orlando, but because at the Pride Parade, there would be many cis white males, and that brought up genuine concerns for their safety. Within this film, and across a spectrum of genders, sexualities, races, and citizenship status, there were incredibly diverse experiences of marginalization, mistreatment, and abuse from within the so-called queer community. One anonymous research participant from Eastern Africa spoke of how he was fetishized as Black. One queer Japanese cis woman spoke of worrying about the eyes of the world, whereby the world and the worry was even within this so-called community. I think this was a very important moment for me. Doing this research and making this film, it leaves me questioning what this community was, and it called out an invisible layer of privilege, of my privilege. Even amongst the marginalization and levels of discrimination, these layers of differences start to take form of the ironies of the queer experience. LGBTIQ is an acronym of definition. As years pass, new letters are added. Everyone included and everyone defined. But queer feels like an attempt to subvert classification and move us beyond the defined. And yet, you call it queer or whatever you want to call it, but this community ain't the community I thought it was. The queer community includes the misogynist. The queer community includes the racist and the transphobic. And it includes all the dirty shades under the sun of privilege and discrimination. For many, our community is not a safe space. The film was dedicated to Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia, the godmothers of our safe space, who were the ones who initiated the Stonewall protests on Christopher Street in New York. The film ends with archival speech in Central Park, circa 1970s. Sylvia takes to the stage and speaks of the horrific violence, sexual abuse that she has experienced. The faded grain of the archive is converted into pixels, and black and white streaks of the speech make it feel the speech and only the speech long. And so was the shot, long. The camera lingers on Sylvia, looking up at the stage, with the sound of big crowds beyond the frame. And in her harrowing speech, assumably heard by a queer crowd, she speaks of everything she's done for the community and how the community has let her down. As a trans woman of colour, she's saying, I was let down. A process that has always been of deep significance is based on this idea of ownership. I would love to move beyond a world of ownership and intellectual property, but I spend the majority of my time as a visual anthropologist and filmmaker working and sharing with collaborators who have been politically and socially marginalized and discriminated against. These include homeless, rough sleeping communities, Indigenous communities, as well as others. When this is the case, and you start to see the value of representation and ownership of those representations in a different light. And such, within my practice of collaborating, I have these thorough processes of review and dialogue. In the case of our film, Our Safe Space, the film was unraveled, the film that unraveled deep issues of community. I spoke with all of the research participants in the final stages of the film. All of the participants were quite happy with the film and believed in sharing it. All but one. There was one voice of opposition, one voice who made me realize the fractured nature of this so-called community. One participant said, "I don't feel comfortable with this film. It's great and I like lots of things about it, but there are voices missing. You don't have trans women of color, and we only have this pride parade because of them. It feels missing." I agreed. When I heard this feedback, I agreed and was grateful for hearing it. I was grateful for being confronted with another layer of invisibility, masked within my cis privilege. I tried to resolve this problem, but it quickly became equally as problematic. It started to feel tokenistic. And as a result, the film was never publicly released. On recently reading the Futurity Report, I came across a dialogue talking about a Guattari film, within which the conversationalists say that the most subversive action in dealing with some films is to not release them. It's the age of fake news, but it didn't mean that I had to perpetuate by calling what we have as a community and calling it our safe space. Part of what I have learnt is that it's important to have everyone involved from the beginning. You've got to have everybody in the room. You create a project and we do it together. I'm less interested in queer as representation or queer in the specific outputs of our collaborations. I'm interested in queer as a practice, in these processes of engagement and in these processes of inclusion. The subversion lay within how we move forward. And as a final little close to my piece, as it's only ever important in the queer world to always acknowledge our friends and to acknowledge the solidarity of doing it together, I just would like to introduce some of my friends in this chat box, just with some links, as some final links, just as some reflections of good practice, both in how we conduct research and film and art projects, as well as for their representational features. But I thank you.
Thank you, Blake, for your contribution. I think it was very moving, at least for me, because I very much appreciate that you decided to frame it through your personal experience. So I very much value this, and I consider it to be a very brave and very transparent move. I would like to ask you, at least 2 questions, and I remind again our audience of their opportunity to contribute to this discussion, not just to be 2 of us talking here together. But my question would be more related to the actual situation, which has been more than a year-long situation of the global pandemic. I want to ask you, how do you feel that this experience of living a very singular individual lives can change us in a way to be more thoughtful regarding the queer as a process of engagement, of creating the hierarchical collectives, of being more a constellation than being those individual atoms in which kind of like a form we are now living. So this is my first question.
Yeah, thank you. I think one really interesting thing to sort of reflect upon is within this process, like talking from a digital anthropology perspective, which I think is an important one when we talk about this experience of the pandemic often being one that's highly mediated, that we now engage in this moment as filmmakers and artists as well. We're having an interesting moment where our camera, which was once just a documenting tool, now becomes an enabler of communicating. So thinking about the mediation is important. I think what I would sort of say is online social sort of patterns and the modes within which we can sort of respond, that's such a fascinating thing now. And I think what we're starting to see with, all sort of digital meeting spaces is often that it's cause or interests or phenomenon related connection rather than ethnic or geo-specific, geo-local sort of traditional community stuff. And so that in itself, I think, in the process of something like, a queer community, which obviously, as I've just articulated, I struggle with as a concept, but at least the ability to now come together online, I think, does hold interesting sort of promise to that. But, I think the other side of it, which is the more skeptical side of just how we're seeing algorithms sort of move and what we now refer to much more of the, fake news echo chambers, all of those sort of aspects also just mean that those dialogues between communities aren't necessarily being seen. So, I wonder, when we sort of make that question of saying, how does a moment like the pandemic affect us in terms of queer? It's probably going to be a very different experience of, whether it's about queer communities connecting as communities themselves, or if it's about how it integrates within like that heteronormative world with effects and things like that.
Thank you for the answer. I definitely find it to be a very challenging time in many ways for many communities, but it really makes me not to think about individual communities, but really trying to get this mental picture of one society and how we have to deal together now with having a dialogue, to face each other and to face each other through the screens at this moment. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, and the other thing is, of course, like on mentioning, the aspect of often issues at home with queer youth and, queer suicide rates and things like that. It's often talking about not necessarily having a safe home. And I think the other really important thing to acknowledge in these moments of pandemics is, we see with domestic violence and, comes that basically this is a moment where if your home is not a safe environment, a lot of those issues are really replicated. So it's, yeah, it's very, very layered, those processes.
Definitely, I do feel that at this moment, those fragile infrastructures are becoming even more fragile and dangerous, therefore, in many, many ways. So my second question would be if you have already had a chance actually to deliver a kind of this kind of lecture, which is very, let's say, self-explorative, as well as you are directly talking using a specific, let's say, academic discourse about struggling with labeling the queer community, and understanding it as a community. So what was the response, if you've ever talked in this very specific way as a lecture, delivering a lecture to the queer community?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's, look, like it's one of these things that to come into this performative element of having a dialogue with the film and seeing me in that sort of performative space, I think I often am very interested in subverting of that practice. I think the most interesting thing about visual anthropology and what compels me to pursue it is that ultimately we're asking a question of saying, in what modality can you best communicate? And I think this is a huge question, for all of us, but particularly when you're coming out of, the shackles of, dirty academia. But it's that question of saying how can you sort of twist and subvert those processes? And I think naturally that comes out here, with that queer sort of aspect. But talking more specifically with this idea of integrating self-voice, I suppose in some cases this is a little bit autoethnographic now, in how I sort of approach this, how I sort of try and grapple with those aspects, but through personal story, vignette, memory. But what I think is just, paramount and is so true for me in my practice is this fundamental dilemma of seeing, anthropology as the social science. And I think the reason what I'm sort of what I hope that I communicated with just talking about the trends in environmental anthropology and digital anthropology is also this shift of practice and how we engage with what even is the human. And the other side of how that works is often by coming back into this complete, talking from my embodied self, talking experiences and feelings, and allowing that to sort of enter that. So I absolutely use this method a lot, and it often feels like a rupture into academia, and that's why I keep doing it, because I just think it needs to. I think the academia needs to, and I think the reason why, particularly dealing with sort of more aspects about my own identity, you just suddenly realize what it means and who can talk about what. And I feel like we all feel like, this was hopefully conversations that we started to understand a long time ago, but I think the reality is now that we're sort of trying to grapple that on a collective level. And personal voices, I can only speak for me.
Thank you very much, Blake. I very much agree with you, and I think that these personal voices, which can directly engage others and can actually create a more safer space within the academia, within the classrooms, and to enable students and our colleagues actually to get to the sense of sensitivity and to the idea of closeness. I think it's very important. We need these personal narratives and voices. to make academia more aware of how we interact together and then how we share, and therefore how we can create the knowledge together.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Blake. Thank you for being our guest. And at this moment, we will move in our program to the second guest speaker. So I wish you the very best, and please stay safe, healthy, and happy in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
As our second guest speaker of tonight's program, here is coming Natálie Drtinová, who is currently holding a position as an editor of the art section in a bi-weekly published Czech cultural magazine A2, A2. And also Natálie studied the gender studies along with the theory of contemporary art, and therefore I believe that her contribution will greatly benefit from actually linking these two very important and interesting spheres. So from her we are going to learn about the Czech and Slovakian contemporary art queer scene. So Natálie, thank you very much for being our guest. I'm very happy that we can meet together. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. Is my presentation? Oh, here we go. Right. So, as Andrea mentioned, I have studied both art theory and gender studies, and the presentation that you will see is the result of my of research, my master's research. I have dealt with queer issues connected to art in both of my theses. And in my gender studies thesis, I have focused on the contemporary queer art in Czechia and Slovakia. And even though the title seems rather understandable and simple, we have to unpack some of the terms right away. Because at first I thought I would call it Czech and Slovakian contemporary queer art, but there's a reason why I ended up with this title, and there's a big difference because I mean can be a bit tricky with calling something Czech or Slovak. I mean, what are the borders? What are the connotation that it bears? Is it tied to the nationality? Is it tied to the geopolitics? It can be a bit difficult to determine that. And some of the art that I'm going to show is not even made by Czech or Slovak artists, or maybe not even made in the Czech Republic or Slovakia. Because the subject of my research, I focused on a couple of exhibitions. It was 6 exhibitions that were group exhibitions that could be called something like group queer contemporary art exhibitions. So the art that I have studied was already presented as queer or gay, lesbian. There's, of course, much more of queer artistic production that could be talked about, but I'm going to talk about art presented at these 6 exhibitions. Maybe I should name these exhibitions. It was the Transgender Me first, second, and third edition that took place in 2011, 2012, 2013. And then the exhibition called Coming Soon, also taken place in 2011, and 2 more recent exhibitions, We Will Not Change Our Show and Queer Stories. Queer Stories is the only one that took place in Slovakia and not Czech Republic. And so you can see that all these rather big group exhibitions have taken place in the past decade. There has been some smaller exhibitions, usually featuring 2 or 3 artists. But I'm not gonna dwell into those that much. Another term that has to be analyzed in this title is the word queer. Of course, it can be sometimes a bit difficult to distinguish queer and LGBT, or queer and homosexual, gay, lesbian. It doesn't have to be. Some people have a very strict definition of each, and the term queer can be antagonizing of the terms like of more strict categories like lesbian or gay. But as we will see, there's some overlapping as well. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Let's say previous generations of art historians have been working with the terms homosexuality or homoerotic very much. I mean, previous generations may be a bit of a reach because these people still publish and live. But we can look at the only Czech publication that works with sexual differences within culture, which is the book Homosexuality in the History of Czech Culture, edited by Martin Putna. Next, please. And now I'm gonna mention some conceptions. I just cannot read this at all. Some definitions to show these differences in the meaning of each of the term. So, for example, Christopher Reed, who is the author of the book Art and Homosexuality, A History of Ideas, says that the rise of the term queer reflected the loss of faith in the coherence of gay and lesbian identity and was intended to unite a wide range of constituencies opposed to conventional notions of sexuality and gender. If queers, in theory, could move freely among forms of gender or sexuality, what they shared was an antagonism to normativity, which included efforts by some gays and lesbians to have these identities accepted as forms of normality premised on biological fixity. As we can see, Christopher Reed really sees the term queer, as many queer theorists do, all of them actually. That's what queer theory is based on. He sees it as something opposed to the strict categories of gay and lesbian. However, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. James Smalls, who is the author of the book called Homosexuality in Art, I believe that's him, who sees the concept of homosexuality quite diversely, as some might see the usage of the term queer. So He says, unlike art, the other term in this book's title, homosexuality, can be defined more specifically. Homosexuality and its emotional aspects have existed in all cultures and in all time periods, long before the invention of the term. Homosexuality is a diverse concept that refers to a range of feelings and emotions. Its meaning will vary for different people at different times and in different cultures. What is clear is that homosexuality cannot and should not be minimalized or limited to sexual behavior alone. So within art history, he sticks to the term homosexuality, even to newer or more contemporaneous periods, and uses them instead of queer. Okay, next. Okay, and last but not least, we have David Chegetse, who is the editor of publication called Queer, which is part of the Documents of Contemporary Art published by the Whitechapel Gallery. And he defines queer art or queerness as outlaw sensibilities, self-made kinships, chosen lineages, utopic futurity, exilic commitment, and rage at institutions that police the borders of the normal. Since its formulation in the crucible of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, queer has an ongoing political and cultural currency that continues to prove catalytic to artists and thinkers. So David Chegetse really ties the concept of queer art to queer politics that were born in the 1980s. And he sees visual culture in general, but queer art more specifically, as something crucial to the politics of queerness in its birth. So this might be one of the more common, let's say, and more progressive notions of queer art. But as Eastern Europeans or people who are not from Western Europe, specifically the UK or USA, we might have an issue with this definition or this notion, because it suggests that the birth of queer politics and queerness and queer art is in the AIDS crisis and in the Stonewall riots, which only after that seems that which some people here in Eastern Europe believe as well, that queerness and LGBT activism and everything has been brought to us from the West, that it's an import from the West, which is not true. I'm gonna deal with that in a second. I'm just gonna say that I have identified 5 major topics, recurring topics that appear in the past, the 6 exhibitions that I have mentioned. And these themes are history, continuity, and archives, being the first one. Then the second one is transness, and transgender bodies. Third one is identities, categories, and visibility. Fourth one is gender norms and sexual norms. And the last one is marriage equality and rainbow families. And now I'm gonna go through these 5 topics, showing you the artworks that deal with these topics. Okay, next. Thank you. So history, continuity, and archives. Next. Okay, this topic appeared in several ways, mainly in the exhibition that took place almost 2 years ago in Brno, in Dům umění, in the Brno Art House, which was called We Will Not Change Our Show, curated by Martin Vaněk and Jula Muškovič. Next. And this is the opening of the exhibition, not the opening, but this is the first room of the exhibition. And the exhibition was opened by the installation of Queer Archives Institute, run by Karol Radziszewski. Karol Radziszewski is a Polish artist who has presented his work in Czech Republic several times. That's why that's why I wanted to include it in the queer art scene of Czech Republic and Slovak Republic, because Karol has been very prominent here. He has collaborated with local artists as well, and Karol has been working. Since 2005, he has been publishing the Dig Fagazine, which is a magazine focused on queerness or gay, mainly gay, male gay communities before 1989. And he has been mapping the communities in post-socialist countries. So the installation showed these very formal glass boxes of the Dig Fagazines. Next. So yeah, here we can see the Czechoslovakian edition of the Dig Fagazine. Each of the boxes basically showcased a different topic. And yeah, even though he mainly focuses on male histories and male gayness or homosexuality, he in the Czechoslovakian issue, he has given quite a lot of space to the lesbian experience before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, next. Yes, so on the left side we can see the part of about Philo magazine, which is kind of the predecessor or inspiration for his Dig Fagazine. Philo was published by Richard Kisiel, who Karol has collaborated with a lot, and he even made this art project about him. It was a movie called Kisieland, which I'm going to talk about in a bit as well. And on the right side we can see all the mentions about AIDS, showing that, you know, even though the AIDS crisis was not perhaps that crucial for the beginning of queer politics here, it also was a topic that was talked about. Okay, next. Okay, these are... Okay, I'm back. Sorry. All right. Yeah, I think we can go to the next one. This is actually from a different exhibition. It was a collaboration between Josef Rabara and Karol Radziszewski, where Karol presented the project Kisieland, and Jože Rabara presented his project called Tomorrow Will Be Different. And they both, next. They presented, they both worked with the history. So while Kisieland was based on the history from around like 1980s, next. Jože Rabara's project was from the first, or it was an archival work dealing with a diary of a person, of a gay man from the first half of the 20th century. So these two were juxtaposed within one project, and it also kind of showed how the history and both history and differences between now and the time before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, next. Okay, so this is another project or art piece from the show We Will Not Change Our Show. This was called Songs and Ballads from Romanian Gay History by Paula Dunker, and Alex Bala, who showed in this classroom setup that different stories about queer people from the history going centuries back to also state socialism in Romania, but also after that, when some of the socialist decisions were continued after the fall. We can go to next. And this is the third instance that history and personal or archives work with in this exhibition. This is called this installation is called Express Yourself, and it was made by Martin Vaniek, who was the curator. And this is his personal collection of Madonna memorabilia, showing his admiration and also what Madonna kind of gave him when he was younger. So I thought this was a very innovative and different approach to archival work, and it's not a community history, but it's a personal history, and it's a very intimate thing. So yeah, I think it was great and kind of brave of him to show this, especially because he's not an artist but the curator. Okay, next. Okay, and now we're gonna deal with the topic of transness. Next. So 3 of the exhibitions, as I said, Transgender Me 1, 2, and 3, were mainly dealing with the topic of transness, but there were other artworks that were dealing with other issues as well. But I'm gonna show these 3 series showing the different cultural approaches, or not approaches, but different cultural instances of transness. This is the community, or these are hijras from India who are trans women who have been in India for ages. This is a photo series by Lukáš Houdek, who was one of the curators of the Transgender Me exhibitions. Okay, next. Yes, this is another series also dealing with traditional community of trans people, trans women again. These are moushes from Mexico, photographed by Yancourt. Next. And another series, also this was taken by an American photographer, Michael Dvorak, and he photographed the Two-Spirit people, who's also old and traditional community of trans people in North America. And next. Yes, and these three series I would like to juxtapose to this one by Lukáš Houdek again, who photographed these trans women in chat rooms online that show very more intimate and controlled, let's say, by the women, intimate portraits, kind of. Yeah, I think we have to move on. So next, thank you. This is the series Mate and Dane by Josef Rabara. This is Jožo photographed these two trans men during their transition, which is always a very, very intimate moment. Next. Yes, they are Mate and Danny. They also performed at the exhibition opening of Transgender Me, because they in that time they worked as a drag duo, drag addicts. They did drag as drag kings. Yeah, next. This is their family. So I think this, the fact that they participated in the opening as well, makes them more than just passive subjects, but active participants of the exhibition. Next. Thank you. So now we have identities, categories, and visibility. Okay, next. So one of the exhibitions, this one was called Coming Soon, and it was dealing solely with lesbian art. The exhibition, the curator, Tamara Moises, was asking herself and the artists who exhibited there, what is lesbian art? If there is something like lesbian art, even. They were looking for a definition, not definition, but for expression of something that they haven't really seen before, because lesbian art is not a stable category that art historians would, for example, use, not in the Czech Republic. So next. I'm going to talk about this one piece by Damian Machaj, who back then still identifies as a lesbian artist, but doesn't anymore. This piece is called After Sarah Lucas, if we can go to the next one, you will see why, because he used this picture of Sarah Lucas and accompanied these pictures by a text where he kind of rejects the category of queer or lesbian art. He says that, in spite of that, in this work, I turn back to examine the grounds of the label queer art. I wonder why I don't feel comfortable seen as a queer artist and why I see this label as a limitation. In my idealistic beliefs in art, I see a body of art as a complexity within the particular individual thing. I think I understand his refusal to be categorized or to be put in a box and be labeled as a lesbian or queer artist. But at the same time, there's this tendency, especially among lesbian artists, not to label their art. And I think even though this exhibition took place 10 years ago, these questions are still relevant because we still don't have a working category of lesbian art here in Czech Republic. Okay, next. All right, so now we're dealing with gender norms and sexual norms. Next. So this piece was made by Alena Faustová. It's called Punishment. And in this piece, she wrote the word or the phrase "I am normal" several thousand times on the wall in docks. I think this is the essence of queer theory, because she is working with norms and deviations, because obviously if she has to write it that many times, she is struggling with the notion or the fact that she is seen as normal. Yeah, next. So these pieces are made by Robert Gabris. It's a series of drawings, pencil drawings on recycled paper called Cyberlove, where he thematizes, well, he deals with the reduction of male homosexuality into the act of the sex, and mainly erect penises and ejaculation. And as you can see, it also says things like "suck me 32, no fat, no Asians, straight acting only," which is referring excuse me, which is referring to the racism platforms like Grindr, where it kind of intersects sexuality with race and gender expression. Okay, we can go to the next one. Yes, another one. This one says, Slovakian fathers, you have nice sons, which is a play on a traditional Slovak song, which also, well, this reference is mainly the heteronormativity and gender stereotypes in Slovakian environment. I think we can go to the next one. And this is Ivan Jurica, his piece, Post-Colonial Violence or Beyond Racialized Desire, where he also deals with the intersection of post-colonialism and sexuality and these complex matrices where all these issues intertwine together. Okay, and now we move to the next one, which is the last topic of marriage equality and rainbow families, which is explicitly connected to LGBT activism, which I thought was important to talk about, even though there are only 2 pieces or 2 artists who deal with this. So next. The first one is Monika Kovachova, who published this, let's call it fake news. This was published in SME blog, but it was in the blog section, so it was not edited by anybody else. And it claims that Slovak gays and lesbians can get married. It's a media infiltration. It was a bit of a provocation because Slovakia doesn't have marriage equality. I think, yeah, she mainly aimed at reactions. Okay, and the last one, or this is the last series. This is Jana Stepanova and her family map. This was a very extensive project spanning from 2004 to 2010, where she photographed these queer families. So, for example, this is Hannes, Christoph, and Martin. 2 dads. One of them is trans. And yeah, basically all these pictures that we're gonna go through now are just depictions of different queer families from different countries. I think it's Germany, United States, and Czech Republic. So next. 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 This is Matty and Danny again. Next. 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 And next. I think these were supposed to be somewhere. Okay, next. And next. Okay, and this picture is my conclusion. I haven't even put the name of the artist, but this is a piece by Gordon Hall. It's called Set 4. I'm sorry. Well, this was not presented in Czech Republic or Slovakia, but it brings me back to David J. Chegetse, because in the book Pink Labor on Golden Streets, he talks, there's an interview with him, it's David J. Chegetse in conversation with William J. Simmons, and they talk about the possibilities of abstractions, transgender and queer capacities. And they see abstract art as an alternative to the politics of representational visibility, which could bring some more freedom to trans artists or trans representation, or not representation, but the issue. And it's something that we, for example, don't see here, or we haven't seen in the 6 exhibitions that I have analyzed. But that doesn't mean that there's no artists who don't work with queer abstraction. It just hasn't been presented to the public as queer art yet. Yeah, and so in conclusion, I would also like to say that we cannot really see when we think back of David Chegetse and his definition of queer art as something full of rage and something super against norms and against institutions and being outlaw and all these things. We see that the art that is presented here in Czech and Slovakia as queer art is different, and it very much deals with sexuality and gender, but not in super explicit ways. But I would say it's more full of enjoyment and not as much rage. This is the Polish art historian Pavel Eschkowitz, who deals with also the topics of queer art and exhibiting queer art. He describes Polish or Eastern European queer art as opposed to very in contrast to the more violent and rageful Western queer art. And I think I have to agree with him with his definition. So thank you for your attention. And the next slide, last slide, maybe. Thank you. Yeah, this is just a thank you to Michelle Adlerová, Lukáš Houdek, and Tamara Moises, who have provided me with the material that I have showed you. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Natalia, for the presentation as well as for the very rich research. I very much enjoyed it, as well as for its very clear structure, which kind of guided us through a big variety of different artists. And also I appreciate a kind of like a theoretical background at the beginning, which actually immediately you've problematized and showed us what is very special about the region in which we live, about the Eastern European context. So my question, the first question, and also I should mention that on a YouTube there was a one note, a kind of like a short feedback by Klára Kierzkowska. I love the Madonna Shrine. So obviously there is another fan of that curatorial project you showed us. So my first question actually goes directly to the contemporary curatorial strategies. I think that not only in the Czech Republic, but more kind of abroad, this queer art is getting to be really on the top of the international attention. A lot of publications, a lot of discussions, and I think that it's getting kind of like a new canon, a new mainstream that has to be included in a way. And so we can definitely find a very careful and thoughtful examples of working with queerness in artistic expressions and artistic research, as well as with less careful and thoughtful and in a way painful appropriation of queer in a curatorial practice. So how would you comment on this, a kind of trending of queer art on international art scene?
Yes, you're completely right. It is kind of problematic, especially when, let's say, feminist issues became kind of trendy queer issues or queerness and queer theory especially can be used as something to fulfill someone's desire for trends and new things, which in a way, of course, yeah, you said the word appropriation. That can be very hurtful. It could be done very badly, and it could be very messy. But the thing is, I don't think it has been that trendy in our environment. I would say maybe universities have adopted it or have started adopting it slowly. It can be used in research. Sometimes, I don't know. I personally, I do have a bit of an issue with this because sometimes people use it interchangeably with deconstruction, which of course is not the same. So even though I don't like to reduce queerness or queer theory or queering to gender and sex and norms and sexuality and all these things, I like to see it connected still. And I honestly, it hasn't been very trendy, or it hasn't been adapted by the big gallery and museum institutions here in Czech Republic. There hasn't been a single, I'm thinking, but I think there hasn't been an exhibition dealing with different sexuality or queerness in museal institution. There was supposed to be one in the Moravian Gallery several years ago, but the project was scrapped, which only shows that there are there's intentions by curators to make these show, make them publish them or show them, but then there's always some issue with the structures of the institution. So I don't think it has been very trendy here, especially among the big leading state institutions or institutions that are tied somehow to the public budget.
Yeah, thank you for your commentary. And my second question is directly linked with the end of your presentation when you were showing us an example of the abstract art, and you were talking about this comparison with more depictive representation, which you were showing us previously, which are mostly involved in the art practice and art research of the local artists or Eastern European artists in general. So do you think that this tendency towards the depictive representation is deriving from this need to make visible the issue of queerness, to make visible the bodies, to make visible the social infrastructure around? And actually, because what I was thinking about, what was my way of reasoning, this depictive representation is more linked with making it public, using the visual communication of, in a way, revolution, of even marketing, something which is very directly talking with a very specific and a clear articulation of individual visual signs. And in the abstract art, uses metaphors and gives you a more space for mental notions which are coming from a kind of, let's say, a deeper levels than this direct thinking that was obvious that should be part of your reaction or respond as a viewer to the depictive representations. So what is your way of reasoning?
So I would like to say two things. Thank you for the question. First thing, if I go back to Pavel Eschkowitz, I believe that was, wait, I'm trying to think. Yes, Pavel Eschkowitz. So when he said that he is against art that makes queerness something destructive or something violent or just ugly, he also talked about this one piece. I don't remember. I don't remember the name of the series, but in Poland, I think he featured it in his exhibition Love and Democracy, if somebody wants to look it up. But there was a series of pictures, and it was just queer couples holding hands, just outside, clothed, fully clothed. And they use these series on the billboards. And it was a big controversy in Poland. So I would say that the reason why we still rely on bodies in queer art so much is because something so simple as holding hands of two people of the same sex is seen as completely disruptive, disrupting the system. So even the slightest sign of queerness in a body can be super powerful in our society, you know. So that's first part of my answer. The second one is, oh yeah, the thing is, I mean, throughout the whole history of art, there has been a lot of queer art, or art that has been made with queer intentions, or queer topics, queer stories, queer people. But it has been kind of erased with history and with art history that has been very heteronormative, and with the institutions that describe these pieces as being as like fitting into the heterosexual matrix. So there might be way more queer art than we know there is, and a lot of work of queer art historians has been queer reading of older pieces. So what I'm scared that might happen with abstract art, even if it's contemporary, the reading might be the queer reading, because there has to be a reading. As you said, there's a lot of space for interpretation. So when there's space for interpretation, there's also space for a heterosexual or heteronormative interpretation and erasure of the queerness that's behind it. So that's why I also think there has been, for sure, a lot of abstract queer art which hasn't been decoded as queer, because that's something that the author would have to tell us, because it's yeah, it can be very hard to interpret abstract art in a new way, especially in a queer way.
Thank you for the both parts of the answer. I think that also this is another interesting point that we might debate on and on about just actually new ways of reinterpreting the canon of the art and the art history. And actually when it can get fruitful, when it can be necessary, and what it can also harm in a way again. So this is, I think, a really interesting mirror of social movements and a kind of emancipation movement that we've been currently experiencing on many fronts. Thank you for bringing up the topic of the queer art and showing us this creative mirror, or putting us the face into this creative mirror to reflect on what we are experiencing right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now there is a time for the third guest of tonight's program, which is Ondřej Trhoň, a cultural critic and a journalist based in Prague, a collaborator with many important and interesting cultural platforms like Czech broadcasting station Radio Wave, or even the Czech television, but a founder and the main author of the independent zine Deeped. So Ondřej is going to tell us more about how the queer theory has been mirrored in the contemporary indie visual games, and how the aesthetics reflect the queerness. So thanks so much, Ondřej, for taking the role of a guest speaker in tonight's program, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So, okay, I'm gonna switch to the presentation mode then. It's gonna take a little while, or actually just a little while, because I was told there's gonna be a transition, which there isn't. So this is like partly awkward, but please bear with me. Okay, here we are. I'm just gonna make myself small. Okay. So, thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, because I kind of remember going to the Fresh Eye, I think it was like 10 years ago or something, as a graduate student. So it's like also partly sentimental to me. So I'm sorry if I'm going to be that. Just please drop in the comments if I'm too much, and I try to adjust myself. But anyway, who am I? And thanks, Andrea, for the introduction. But I want to kind of emphasize why am I here, right? So apart from being a big fan of games and writing about games, and being mostly focused on those titles that could be termed indie or avant-garde or underground, I also did my master thesis about queer games, specifically about one of the queer games I'm about to show you. And I also lecture visual studies over at Faculty of Art, Charles University. So this is like sort of my background. So like I don't think, or I wouldn't call myself really academic. So what I've prepared for you is more of a kind of a very free-form dive into some concepts from queer theory, some concepts from game theory, and also some concepts from very contemporary, I think, feminist, radical, subversive, whatever theory. But first, we need to kind of, set the stage, because I know we're on a Fresh Eye. I know this is a visual studies platform, but I want to emphasize very much that games aren't a thing that is there to be read in one way. I mean, this is probably very much true about any art form, but specifically in the games and the game studies, because it's fairly new field, there have been some very, like, in hindsight, super formalistic debates about whether games are more like text or whether they are more like systems of rules or whatever. And I think it's important that we look at games not just as visual objects, not as just audiovisual objects, but objects with like multiple affordances. I'm going to show you like some ways before we get to the examples how to think about games and what to look in games. But I think this multimodality, fancy academic word, is I think really key here. and also very much key to the whole aspect of queer and queering. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Yeah, because first, like, what are games, right? Like, there's this assumption, or at least I think, that when we are talking about games or video games, there is a still of shitload of some assumptions, right? I mean, I don't know what is your like first mental image of a game, but I bet it for a lot of people it's actually something, I don't know, along the lines of Counter-Strike, maybe like racing games, like the typical entertainment. And like the days where we had to fight for games as an art form are long overdue, but still it's very like I think important to say that games are today, as of in 2021, and in like the second decade of 21st century, are a ubiquitous, very broad, very diverse medium. And talking about games makes, I guess, as much sense as talking about films, right? So like you have Hollywood, you have Godard, like, and the same can be said about games. Like we have Blizzard, Warcraft, whatever, we have Underground. And I'm going to talk about where I situated this talk in just a little while. But I want to kind of just like, I think I kind of mixed my my slides there. But anyway, before we dive into the queer thing, I want to show you this, yeah, admittedly kind of off-putting chart, I think. But what is important is that unlike books or unlike movies or unlike, I don't know, almost any other more traditionally codified art form, perhaps apart from conceptual art and like very much contemporary art, there is a certain set of formal properties that it's easy to pinpoint, right? Like you have a book and it contains words, and like these words are formed either into stanzas in your poetry or into paragraphs. Sure, but like that there is some essence, at least like in some way, to be found, definition. And with games it's been quite a problem, because games are super multimodal, and like if we say, yeah, games are something that you're supposed to be able to win, well, not quite. There's a lot of games with no winning conditions. Okay, so games are something like, we're competing in it. There are scores, there are action. Well, not really, because in a lot of games, and especially queer games, there are no like valorized, another fancy word, outcomes. So, and I don't want to like, be super big here on game theory or anything. I just want to emphasize again that game is, I think, something that like really is composed of a lot of interlocking parts. Like we have aesthetic dimension, we have like the game mechanic dimension, we have perhaps like the contextual dimension, and it all like works together somehow to create the whole thing that happens with us, or between us and the game when we're playing it. And before I kind of go into the queer thing, I want to just like quickly give shout out, and this is probably like a not required reading. I'm sorry, I'm not in my class, but suggested reading if queer games is or are something that you are interested in and you want to learn more about. I think those 3 books especially are super great to dive into. They are really accessible. The first one, the Queer Game Studies, is actually a book that I was drawing heavily from in my master thesis, and it's like it's a little old. It's 2017, I think now, and it's basically like an overview of queer game studies, because queer game studies is still like an emerging field of study, and it's super eclectic, kind of essay collection where you can find stuff that starts with queering game controllers and like feminist critique of the Xbox controller and like the X button, up to like trying to apply some horror visual studies or film studies devices onto contemporary games. And like the book basically ends up with like very community oriented projects and interviews. So this is like a very nice game studies or queer game studies primer. What is maybe a little more interesting to you, or could be, is the last book, The Queer Games Avant-Garde, and that's actually the book that's been super instrumental in me researching for this particular talk. and it includes interviews. I think like a lot of them. It's like 20 interviews by this leading scholar Bonnie Ruberg, and they interviewed literally the leading figures in the queer game world. And so those are like the readings you could do if you want to learn more. And also I think it's legal in Czech Republic. It's like you can borrow them on LibGen if you want. But where are we now, and like actually what we're going to talk about? There are several tensions in play. Okay, that was not pun intended actually, but it's quite nice. But there are several tensions in play here in my or like when we start to think about queer games, there are several like lines we have to cross, and one of them is the line between avant-garde and indie mainstream. What I mean by that, because when you Google queer games, queer game characters, queer game whatever, you will encounter, the first thing you'll encounter probably is something along Overwatch or something along AAA game, right? So we have I don't know how many of you are gamers. So like if you, okay, this is actually a good spot to, if you are a gamer, or like please drop into the chat below. I'm watching it. Drop what, like if you're a gamer, if you're playing, if you're familiar with what I'm talking about, so we can have like a little more. I know it's hard through the through the internet, but like at least we can have some sort of like at least partly like double-way dialogue there. But we have the issue of queer representation in mainstream, and what's been happening together with like a more larger cultural shift in recognition of queer themes, at least in some parts of the society and world. There has been a quite increase, let's say, in representation of queer characters in AAA games. So like the clear example is Overwatch, which is this like massively multiplayer online shooter that is like very colorful. It's like super hit. It's made by a big hit studio, and it includes like these playable characters, like you can play as them and as heroes. It has like all this overarching lore that is like built through comic books and so forth, and it includes canonically queer characters. And what it does is the creators are introducing them like throughout the life cycle of the game. So like I think we learned the Tracer, which is the character there with this glowing gun and in the yellow body. I think she was like pronounced queer in what could have been the second or third year of the game, and the guy next to her, I think he's called Soldier 77 or something, or Soldier 7, and he's also queer or like revealed to be gay. He's been revealed to be gay like 3 years ago. So, and then you have games like Dragon Age, which have canonically trans characters, for example. You have like a multiple of games and like growing number of games that are like your typical gaming experience, right? So they are like adhering to like the standards that you'd expect from video game industry. And the word industry is actually very important here, because when we're talking about this kind of queer representation, which I don't want to deal actually that much in this talk, there's always like the a little radical doubt that if it's being if it's earnest, right? Like, are we really achieving something by putting queer characters into mainstream games, which are otherwise following the same logic, often are made in like a very shady, like material conditions, with a lot of overtime, with like dubious amount of actual representation in the gaming process. And even though there is totally nothing wrong with like somebody identifying as queer and playing Overwatch and like being delighted that there is like an actually queer character, or I don't know, being trans, playing Bayonetta, which is one of those characters, like super sexualized characters, but she's very often like read as queer because what queer is also excess, and also like the issue of reading something as queer is like a very understandable device in a world that is largely heteronormative. But there's like ever present danger of cooptation, of queer becoming yet another box for marketers to sell, right? So like, is this the queerness we're looking for? And I'm actually asking this open-ended question with no clear answer to sort of draw attention to the disputed nature of asking what is queerness in games. And just like a little self promo, this is a model I've kind of envisioned for my thesis that's been actually inquiring about reception of an autobiographical queer game by queer people. It was a trans game by trans people, and again we have like this stuff that there's an identification that arises from the interplay of engagement, aesthetics, and some what thing we call procedurality, which is like the game mechanics. But like the question of queer coding and queer representation, I think it's essential to ask by who and for whom. And there is another like a very like interesting dissonance here between queer as identity, that like we're happy with having representation of different identities, and that's that, or queer as resistance, as some kind of very like attempt, or some kind of like brave, that's not the right word, but like some kind of attempt to dismantle or subvert or attack or reform or remix the things we are like perceiving as natural or as like typical for games, and to turn them around. So, and this is the difference actually between the queer and queering. And as you probably guessed from or can be difference, because those are obviously slippery terms, but as you probably guessed from the name of my lecture, I'm going to focus on queering example, which goes, by the way, hand in hand with queer. But to kind of, before we get to many examples I have, and I will have many, so please bear with me through this kind of a more academic introduction. I've actually picked two things or modes of interacting with games that open themselves to queer interpretation. So first thing is the notion of counter gaming, which is actually a notion by this kind of a known video game scholar called Alexander Galloway, and it's been appropriated by theorist Edmond Y. Chang to present multiple ways games can queer the medium itself. Because the games I'm about to show you are games that are in one way or another, be it visual, be it mechanical, be it metaphorical, are doing something not with the society, but also with the medium itself. And I'm presenting those ideas not with an aim to, I've read a lot of things, but to kind of, show you what, like the amount of things you can look for when I will be discussing different examples. So we have queer designing, queer play, we have queer remediation. Like the first two are quite self-explanatory. They are like, subverting the dominant assumptions of what play and game design looks like, and like very different ways this can be present in games I will get onto later. We have queer remediation, which could be like using older forms of media, using older forms of games with some new playful way. And we have queer futures, which is obviously like imagining horizons that go beyond heteronormative productive life, that go beyond what is possible at this moment, and are very much tied to, I think, what perhaps has been with queer studies for some time. As an example would be Jose Esteban Munoz and his cruising utopias and queer utopias conceptions. And like B is like a different layers of games we can look for queerness in them, right? So like the first one is characters and stories. So what stories are there in the particular game? Are there any queer characters? What stories do they tell? Are those stories truthful? Are they made with queer people in mind? Then we have gameplay. We have question of agency. Who is the driving force in the game itself? What are the activities we can do in the game? Are those like the traditional ones? Or is the game trying to perhaps subvert something and valorize some other outcome than victory and domination and colonialism and whatever. We have authors and means of production. We have the question of who makes games, for whom they make them. Are they paid enough? What channels are there for them to distribute their work? Are they represented enough in the very big blob of the medium we call video games? Aren't we overlooking them? Are they legit part of the game community? And then we have communities and players, meaning queer events, queer expos, queer jams, queer support boards, games that are like on the verge of physical and digital world and all those stuff. So there are multiple layers we can look on queerness and try to find it in games. But before, I think this is the last stop before I will jump right into the sorry, I just need my to rearrange it here. Before I jump into the long line of pictures, is the question of queer games and art, because thanks so much for the first two presentations, because I think they have raised issues that are going to connect very much with what I'm going to be showing and talking about. And one of them is a question of games and art. And I don't want to, be sorting the question, are games art here? Because obviously they are, or at least they can be, as much as films can be, and books can be, and I don't know, like any performance can be. But I want to kind of draw, and this is actually not my thought. It's from the book, one of those books. Is that actually there is a long line of inspiration from art world, and especially from art movements like Dadaism or Situationism, that is very much tied to the concepts of play and experiment and creating some environments and situations where things can happen otherwise. And I think actually this is the inspiration from art is something that the artists themselves also talk about a lot. And so this is the connection between what we traditionally perceive as avant-garde art and what I'm talking about as avant-garde games is actually closer than you'd guess. So, and I like this only makes sense in a world where we have art students making games over at Academy of Fine Arts. We have game students, game creators rising from the art background and so forth. So I think we can only see those two worlds getting closer and closer together. And I think queer games are something, or are one of those touching points very clearly. But before we really get to the most fun part, I want to just drop here one of the more interesting things that happened in contemporary feminist theory, I guess, and it's a glitch feminism book by Legacy Russell, and she put together this. It's actually part manifesto, part critical contemporary art reader, and it's basically. If I should sum it up somehow, it's a very cybernetic way of doing feminism, feminism that doesn't acknowledge something like in real world. Instead of in real world, you have away from keyboard. So it totally is prepared to utilize the cybernetic culture, and it's really much building on those feminist and queer movements of the 90s, but with a special angle on body, embodiment, community building in the cyberspace, and also the function of bodies and identities in the whole techno matrix of say Instagram or internet culture we have right now. So instead of direct actions, it speaks about glitches and about viruses, about encryptions, about errors, ghosts, and those propagating I'm looking for a word here, sorry, I'm not a native speaker, propagating slight changes to the whole fabric system that can create some safe spaces, or new spaces or redefined spaces for what it even means to be, for example, queer or human or a woman or or a person, right? So I don't want to go into depth really, because this is not about that. But this, I think it's very nice to like read games, especially those games which are disseminated today on Twitter and on various cybernetic networks, as being part of a larger cybernetic social justice movements. And like glitch feminism, I think it's very nice and very readable actually, and very poetic, a perspective that can be applied to a lot of games. I'm going to talk just in like 2 slides actually. And I want to end this like academic introduction, I think, or like more theoretical introduction, with this great quote, what actually queerness in games is, and queer has in common with games. This is a quote from the book Video Game Avant-Garde, or Queer Video Game Avant-Garde, by Bonnie Rubert. Queerness and video games share a common ethos, a longing to explore alternative ways of being. So basically what all the people, all the creators, all the games I'm going to show in one way or another, in myriad different ways, are trying to do is to create and imagine something that goes beyond what is what is prescribed, what is heteronormative, what is usually deemed as the the way things are supposed to be. And I kind of tried to organize my slides here and the games. Right, that's right. We will have a game just on the next slide, into like very loose categories or devices they use to queer not only medium but also like the queer society as well. And the first one is embodiment and transgression. And I think this is pretty obvious in a case of Robert Yang. Robert Yang is also a theorist and a scholar and a person who was teaching at a New York's University Game Center, like a very prominent figure. And he has this series of very colorful, very cheeky, very fun, gay queer games that are like entirely about game experience, right? So this first one is about showering. So like this basically a gay shower simulator. This second one, they both are from a collection that's called Radiator. It has first and a second part. And this is like actually a simulator of shifting gears in a car. Like by shifting gears, you're pleasuring the car and the car responses. So it's like this is very like a playful metaphor for some kind of like gay or like at least penis-based sex that is very much in line with playful nature of some artistic experiments. It's transgressive in a sense that it is not resigning on queer sexuality. And truth to be told, Yang's work is often banned on, for example, streaming platforms such as Twitch, because they don't allow explicit content. So even though you can have like the most gorish and like abhorrent war stories there, like a nice BDSM consensual session, no way. So I think Yang's work not only shows what embodiment and playfulness can look like in games, but also shows the limit what queerness in the games can look like, right? Like, and this actually points to a very visible double standard when we have super sexualized but still covered women bodies, like for example in Overwatch, and then you have like a pretty innocent queer simulator of like sending consensual dick pics. That's another of his games, and that's not allowed for some reason. So yeah, go figure for yourself anyway. So I totally like all those games, and this is actually very true for a lot of games I'm going to be showing, are small vignettes trying to capture a singular experience. So like this one is Spank Me Plenty, or Hurt Me Plenty. I think it's called Hurt Me Plenty in a sort of like in video game culture joke on Doom, but it's basically just a BDSM, it's like a not vanilla but soft BDSM simulator with like a gay tones, and like it's actually just like he's trying to express his life, right? And this is what connects the world of art and world of art games and queer games and indie games and avant-garde games, because a lot of those games are directly inspired by queer lives. A second example of embodiment that is more metaphorical, but also perhaps a little more, I don't know, universal, but I'm not sure. It's called Octodad, and it's actually a game where you're playing an octopus. It's this sentient octopus in a world where kind of everybody doesn't seem to notice that you are in fact an octopus, and you have to move around the space with those like long tentacles, and obviously it's hard, and obviously it's slippery, and obviously it's very inconvenient. And you might be asking what is queer about that, but actually this has been talked about quite a lot as a game that did for a lot of queer folk capture, for example, the feeling of undergoing bodily transition, or getting over some body issues. That, like, this is a great scene in Octodad where you're like preparing for a wedding, and you're like, you need to get there and kiss your wife and kind of put the ring on, and it's like super typical heteronormative situation, but you're this weird alien. And like, as we will see, this metaphor of being alien, of being monstrous, is something that is very consciously deployed by queer people as a metaphor or as a way of relating to some of more less, I think, like, well, not narratively, but like, yeah, something that's like a little more tangible, like those bodily sensations that like present themselves as great opportunities for trying to somehow understand them through the game, because game offers the hands-on control, at least to some extent. And even though this is like a visual studies class, I think there's a lot of visuality to all those games. Like, we have, like, this is like some kind of hyper realistic 3D game that also is like, I think, in a slight dialogue with like these HDR, biggest amount of polygons, the most polished way of doing AAA games. And then we have something that is like more cartoonish, more metaphorical, and then we have Realistic Kissing Simulator, a really great online free game for 2 players, actually, from author Jimmy Andrews and Lauren Schmidt. And it's a game where you basically play side to side on one keyboard, and you're trying to kind of kiss each other with tongues in like these 2-player kissing session. And it's totally awkward, and that is totally on purpose. And again, there's a multiple ways to read this. The visual metaphor for like non-coded bodies and like super minimalistic graphics is there. It's also very funny, and like, it's obvious that a lot of queer art is actually very funny. And like, you can either read this as a kind of a more general, and all of those readings are right, kind of a more general way of like, the awkwardness of trying to kiss somebody for the first time, or trying to get in tempo, or like with your partner, like actually feel like very similarly a lot of times. But at the same time, it very much speaks about some like the embodiment, like, right? So like, when you're playing it, you're like not really in control of your body, and there's like a lot of awkward moments and weird moments, and moments that like are very embarrassing. And like, for example, I think when Bonnie Ruberg was talking about it in one of her talks, she was talking about it, or sorry, they were talking about it as an example of trans embodiment, where this reminded us, a lot of queer people, of their experience of kissing for the first time, like, for example, during transition. It's also queering the game in a mechanical sense. Then there is no goal, there's no victory. You actually have to consent before you can kiss, which is actually really nice. So it like teaches you some rules of consent. And also, you can just like play indefinitely. So it's like anti-productive game, right? So it's like a pure game where you're just embarrassed with your friend, partner, random person for how long you want to. Yeah, exploring queerness outside of sexuality theme comes back. Yeah, and we'll have more of those actually. So this was embodiment, and in one important thing, a lot of those games are freely available. So like you can like this one is really freely available. A lot of work from Robert Yang is freely available. So feel free to try them for yourself. But then we have metaphor and appropriation. Like you can really see those are very loose because obviously the previous games were also metaphorical. But I think Dysphoria, which is actually the game that brought me to queer game studies and the game I did my research on, is very interesting in this regard. It's a game that is basically composed of a lot of smaller mini games. It's a game by trans woman called Anna Anthropy. She's also been on the spearhead or forefront of this like queer game movement. I really urge you, if you're into this stuff, like Google her online. She also put out this book, Rise of Video Game Zinesters, trying to help aspiring authors to kind of create games with their own experiences. And this game specifically is about experience of undergoing medical transition. So there you have some sort of like metaphorical mini game where you have to fit with the weird shape into the wall, and it doesn't work and feels weird, and is a metaphor for a body in transition. You have like a mini game where everybody misgenders you. Then you have like 4 levels, gender, hormonal, medical bullshit. And I think this game is really telling of like very much different, also visual devices queer makers use. So the game Dysphoria is very obviously inspired by an older generation of video games. It's very admittedly lo-fi, 8-bit. It kind of takes your control a little away from you because it switches those scenes without your input, so you're really not in control. But this fact is actually very interesting because it can be interpreted as Anthropy, the author, just letting you live through her memories, but not giving you control because it's not your life. And actually, when we are talking about queer lives and the question of agency, letting somebody else live your queer life is can be a very problematic thing, at least for a lot of people. And I think Dysphoria very beautifully combines playfulness and the feedback loop between game and the player, whilst not, but whilst still getting along or passing along the message that this is not your story to tell. This is not your game to win. This is but her experience of transition that she decided to capture this way, and you're kind of a invested onlooker, right? And also, this game is very obviously inspired by WarioWare and like those kind of like very simple games from like a retro era. And actually, what was cited by a lot of people in my research, because I interviewed them after they played this game for the first time, and they were trans people, was that the metaphorical and very aesthetically simple and minimalist nature of the game actually helps them sympathize with the main character and identify with the hardships she is undergoing through. So this is another function of metaphor, I think, that games are good at, in a very limited manner, but still like eliciting some sort of empathy or immersion or identification. And for a lot of queer games, they deploy very minimalist and aestheticized and not real or hyper-real graphics. And I think this is apart the question of production value, because it's super hard to make like a flashy game, like a 3D flashy AAA game, but also it's just like on purpose because the metaphoricity allows your work to be perceived by a little more amount of people. One of the more interesting genres, or like the genres that is typically being used as a queer genre, are visual novels. And visual novels, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but visual novels are a genre that's been around for a long time, and it's a genre that is basically, I don't think this is really a good example, but yeah, this one. It's like a genre where you're basically having a conversation with people and asking them stuff and like reading a lot, making some decisions here and there. But basically, it's like an interactive fiction kind of thing, like right, like a game book sort of, with a heavy emphasis on visuals and like visual style. And visual novels, due to the easiness of their making and accessibility to a lot of tools, and they're grounding in like some sort of fandom, I'd say fandom communities, because there's a big, like huge amount of anime and manga themed visual novels have found their way as a genre into queer. And I think we've been seeing a great deal of interesting ones with like quite interesting mechanics. So one of the latest hits that is also available on mobile is If Found. And it is a game that needs to be played with video on, because it's a game that uses this very simple mechanic of erasing stuff. So basically your finger acts like an eraser and you're smudging your way through the different parts of the story of this young, as we will learn later, queer person struggling with being brought up in a very rural outreaches of Ireland, while being also simultaneously experiencing some sort of sci-fi, like end of the world scenario, right? And it's a very like personal story set in a very interesting locale or interesting country and context. It's really refreshing to see a game about Ireland and full of Irish trivia, and also there's the mechanic of smudging and like erasing your memories, history, and like trying to deal with the past with the aim of like getting into the present is very touching. And this game has been like super popular lately in the queer and indie game circles. Another example of where sex gets back is another BDSM themed game that is about actually cross-dressing girls. It's called Lady Killer in a Bind. It's by an author called Christine Love. And as you can see, we have a very wide range of aesthetic expression, with this one being very much in contact with some like anime-esque aesthetics. Yeah, and it's basically a BDSM game that like very much talks about consent and what does like the actual BDSM relationship, sub dom relationship looks like, and it's very much talking about topics that are not necessarily explored in the right way in the mainstream and in games, like not at all almost, right? But again, it's something that's very personal. It's also very cheeky, very fun, but at the same time, it's pushing boundaries of what can video games be used to tell stories about. And then we have Butterfly Soup, another free game about a bunch of queer teenagers growing up in like a typical high school. It's like a queer, super queer retelling of a high school drama with like very diverse cast of characters. Basically all of them are girls with different nationalities and ethnicities, and there's a lot of love between them, a lot of heartbreaks between them, and like Butterfly Soup is heralded as one of those queer games that is very, very nicely and tactfully written, while also dealing with topics of coming up and being a gay inside a certain collective. And then we have consent. I've actually talked about consent like a little while ago, but we are again the question of the other and question of aliens and monstrosity comes back through this great, brilliant, and I really love to play the game that's called Consenticle, that's being kickstarted, which I guess it's very interesting to just, a queer game that's been kickstarted. That's cool. So we also have we can really see like a rising appreciation of queer works in video games, also through money. Like there are successful Kickstarters, there are successful, like hugely successful queer games. So we are now, I guess, in a position where you can make queer games and make money out of it to some extent. So that's really cool. But back to Constant Tackle. Constant Tackle basically is a card game which you can buy, print, and play. I have done so, and it's hilarious. And you play one of it's for 2 players. One of them plays as this alien, very hentai alien, I know, and the other one plays as this girl or person. Like I don't think she's gendered there, but like person, and you're in an intimate encounter. It's perhaps sex. It's not specifically stated, but like queer intimate encounters are not just about sex, right? So this is another like subtext in a lot of those games, and it's basically a game about consent and about empathy and about solidarity. So you have to communicate with your player or with the other player about what cards which are depicting like the different actions you can take with the body of the second player, and then like be in sync, be in tandem, and like play the right cards together. And there are like different different levels of difficulty. Basically they mean how much you can communicate with the other player. But it's a game again where there is no actually win or lose. It's a cooperation, and card games, one versus one more, have traditionally been games about winning. So this is a game about actually cooperating and winning by making everybody happy in the end, whilst being so cute, and like everybody loves hentai tentacles. So nothing to not love here. Speaking of the other, we also have like some very explicit games. When I said at the beginning that it's very nice of Robert Yang that he doesn't refrain from showing queer sexuality, we also have a game that's called Hard Coded that doesn't refrain from showing trans sexuality through this metaphor or like a device or futuristic device or a persona of an android who is also part sex worker. And it's a very heart-warming, touching, also admittedly sexy and hot video game that like gives you control over her, and it's again super successful. It has a very big following on Patreon, and it's a game that is transgressive. It's sexual, but it's sexual in a way that actually there's a word for that, empowers, but also validates sexuality of trans women, not just as some objects of desire, but as desiring objects or as desiring subjects. What is what I wanted to say. So there's a lot to be actually talked about in terms of erotic games. If you're into erotic games, please check out this journalist Anna Valens. I think I'm going to write it down in chat because I haven't put it in there, but she's really great. I did interview with her. She is exploring different ways queerness and sexuality and kink can intersect in gaming, and it's actually a very interesting subgenre of games that can show different ways of desiring, different ways of embodiment in sexual ways that can be very empowering for a lot of people. So that's that, and this tight ties with the game that is probably the most fun of all those, and and the most monstrous and also futuristic ones, and it's called Genderect. Genderect is a game that was made by Heather Flowers and Ryan Rose Essay. I'm not sure if I'm reading those names correctly because again I'm not a native speaker and those names are hard, but it's a game about fighting gender. So how do you seek to understand gender? It's a game full of very, very weird monsters. It's a game that allows you to choose a variety of different pronouns for you. Right here, you can even type those of yourself. And it's a game that really like playfully shows you many different ways of like relating to gender through the literal mouths of those monsters. And again, it's very aesthetically crude on purpose. It's very DIY. It's very unapologetically camp in like a very weird monstrous way. So Gendirect, really nice thing. It's also a visual novel, so like a lot of reading, but also super fun reading when like the mouth like tree with teeth tell you, I'm certainly not masculine. You know, go figure. So it's like a really nice, very aesthetic exploration of queerness in ways that like not possible. We're thinking about queerness just as this token-like representation. Please let's have more queer snipers, right? So I want to have more queer tweets with teeth. So that was Gendirect, and we're slowing into the end. I promise. I'm probably talking more than 30 minutes. I'm sorry. And this is actually really nice. So this is a quote from the author of Gendirect, from the from Ryan Rose essay, and she said, I want to make art that expresses how it feels to be trans, queer, and mentally ill, to feel like something at your very core is broken because you're assembled from scars and broken glass and pieces of trash, so that others who feel the same way can take away the lesson that they are not alone in this world. And I think this really nicely captures the ethos of the games I'm showing you, because those are games made by queer people, for not only but for queer people, drawing from their own experience and trying to conceptualize those experiences with devices that are very aesthetic. We also have this like really, I'm gonna be quite quick here, just like take those two as a very good tips. We have a visual novel that's called Who We Know the Devil, from Pillow Fight Games, where we again have like a monstrosity and satanity as a sort of metaphor for transness and queerness, in some sort of, I'd say, cheeky dialogue with like these moral panics by religious conservatives. And then we have Heaven Will Be Mine, one of my most favorite games of like last 2 years, I think. It's a visual novel about trans girls in, not only trans, but trans girls and queer girls in space, where they are fighting big robots. It's very clearly inspired by some mecha anime, but on this alternative future sci-fi background, it really talks lengths about emotion, about relationships, about fragility, about building a world for yourself that is somewhere other than planet Earth, as it turns out in the game's narrative. And it's beautifully written, by the way. Yes. And then last but not least, I think it's last but not least, I'm so sorry, it's Queer Memories. And no talk about queer games can be complete without Gone Home, which is one of the seminal games about queer experience. And it's a game from the genre that's called walking simulators. So basically the game has a very little actual action. You're just basically returning home and going around this huge house and just shuffling through the things and like looking at things and reading old papers and interacting with the environment. And you're returning home, and then you suddenly find out that your sister was closeted queer, and you found the letter to her girlfriend, and you're forced to reckon with this queerness inside your family in the game, and like it all happens in like this domestic space. And yeah, it's in this very like low-key traditional 3D world. And I think this is also something to keep in mind, that queer games can be very innocuous in a lot of ways and kind of subtle in their messages, and they don't have to be monstrous eclectic combinations of various different things. So this has Gone Home. Again, I don't want to spoil it. it's kind of old, so it's like 2014, I think, or 16 at this point, so you can like easily find it in some sort of sale. But it's one of the games that has really defined the discourse back in those days about what can you say in a video game about queerness. So queer as memory and queer as domestic identity. That's gone home. Yeah, and like last, I think, yeah, okay. I have 34 minutes, so I'm gonna end probably with this game, which is a game that is very beautiful and actually has a very interesting story. It's a game about success and failure, which are both very queer-filled topics, and it's called Celeste. And it's this very hard platformer when you're controlling a young woman called Madeline, and when she's climbing this huge ass mountain. Yeah, so like, and it's basically this arcade game that is super hard, but can be accommodated even to like less experienced players because it has a very nice assist mode. But it's a game that is very literally about trying to overcome your fears and your anxieties and like the shadow of your former self. I'm not going to spoil it, but there are like literal episodes where you're fighting yourself in one way or another, and the goal is to get to the apex, right, to the top, which is like super empowering, like healing experience for Madeline as well, for a lot of queer players. And the game actually came out and was basically talked about a lot, like a metaphor for mental illnesses, metaphor for anxiety, and like very heartfelt story. And it's been adopted to some extent by queer people, but its author came out as trans, I think it was half a year ago, and actually said that she realized that the game is trans and that the Madeline is trans in like after completing it. That like her queerness kind of channeled through into the Celeste. So this is a game that is about queerness, but much more in an abstract way. And of course, with success comes failure. I don't think we have really like a time for this, but Thomas Was Alone is basically a puzzle game with like a different geometrical shapes and objects, and those objects are like have a very differing emotions and gender expressions. And this game was actually framed by queer theorist Jack Halberstam as an example of some sort of queer failure, all right? So like Jack Halberstam theorizes this notion of queer failure, where one of the constituting factors of queer identity is the failure to live the standards of heteronormativity, to follow the traditional productive life. Like you have childhood, teenagehood, adulthood, then you have mortgage, kids, whatever. Whilst when you're trans, you probably like have second puberty, or like your life is different from reproductive rights, right? So this failure to be heteronormative is something that can be exemplified a lot in games via visual and gaming metaphors. So that was like a last, I think, academic drop. And like this is the last game I want to show you. Actually, it's a game called Limb. When you're playing super abstract game, it's probably the most abstract game I've shown you yet. And it's a game about this colorful square, and you're asked to move through this spaces with different squares who are like reacting to you, and like the gameplay changes depending on how they react to you and you react to them. And it's a game that was made by a queer developer, Merit Kopaz, and it's a game about not like it can be interpreted, because obviously the author is dead and like you can interpret it as however you want. It's a game about trying to fit while not fitting everywhere at the same time. So again, we have like some kind of social failure. You can see, you can even like get outside the plane, the normal playing plane that is defined by the rest of the non-colorful rectangles. And like the Lim uses this very simple visual metaphor coupled with a very, and like this is why I urge you to play it, very hands-on distress when the vibration occur in the game that is trying to communicate a sense of kind of not fitting in whatever the system, the world, the society on now on the left is. And that was Lim. And I want to end up with like this. This is actually the last sentence of the book I was talking about, of the book The Queer Avant-Garde, the Queer Games Avant-Garde. These games and their creation represent the work of the body, of touch, of intimacy, of feeling, of political resistance that manifests as self-care, of queer identity and queer desire as a source of power. Queer games put the medium of video games to new purpose. Through these games, we as queer players and queer people are invited to reimagine our pasts and our futures, but also, and perhaps most importantly, the realities of our present. So this really captures the different aspects of all those games I've shown you. Like those are games that are trying to deal with some baggage of current video game world. They are subverting the current practices of video game world. They are in contact with larger queer communities and queer attitudes towards living, and they are also very powerful devices for capturing personal stories, personal feelings, and doing that in a unique way that combines aesthetic and mechanic elements together to create a very experience that is very much close to something which we very easily could call, without the tag video game, as contemporary queer art. And those are the three games that have been instrumental in my research and also in my thinking about queer games. So I'm gonna drop this presentation right away below so you don't forget it. And thank you very much. And now, like, please fill the chat with your questions or something. And I'm trying to.
Andrei, thank you so much for the contribution. And that this was really fascinating lecture, and I appreciated both parts, the theoretical one as well as all those practical examples. So I will wait if there are any questions coming through the chat, but I would like to ask you one question which immediately emerges in my mind. So the question is about non-queer players. You've mentioned that these games are usually played by queer players, but not exclusively, and also they are not meant exclusively for this particular group of players. So do you have or are you familiar, or do you have any data about both, for example, the interviews with non-queer players, if this is if these games can, for example, serve as a tool of kind of like empathic prosthesis, that they can easily transfer a very unique experience, which is very difficult to imagine or just to grasp through the words of sharing.
Right. Well, I don't think I have a clear-cut answer to that. And by the way, thanks so much for the compliments. I was very happy to present it on this platform. Well, if you'd ask Anna Entropy, the author of Dysphoria, she would probably tell you no. She actually, after there's been like a lot of reaction after she released Dysphoria back in 2013, I think, a lot of people, and by a lot of people I mean straight cis people, were claiming that like now they understand queer experience. Now they know what it's all about, which is obviously not true. And so I would be wary of saying that games can make somebody understand what it's like to be queer, like literally, because they probably can't. And it's always like just a mediated experience. It can probably illuminate some of the aspects of living. And I think actually, to kind of answer properly, I think the games can be very successful in communicating not the like phenomenological feeling of being queer, but maybe they are very useful in communicating the systemic struggles that queer people encounter, right? So the example with Lim would be probably like with like I think yeah in the first talk there was a mentioning of straight privilege, and this is very much present, and I think like a lot of people don't recognize it all of the time, and games can actually show you via their systemic nature and via having you interact with those systems of oppression directly, how oppression not feels like in real world, but at least approximate that feeling, like the Lim tried. So, but it always comes with the caveats, right? It always boils down to what the framing is, what devices the game using, yeah, I haven't done interviews with non-queer people for the thesis, so I'm not good on that part. But like yeah, the sheer popularity of those games either tells us that there is something very important that queer people can bring into the medium, because obviously all this popularity isn't only from queer people, and that their stories matter and that people are interested in their stories. And if it even sometimes it even like I think it's enough to put stories out there, and like they will connect in some way or another with some others in the future, and it's step by step. I don't know, like this is not a critical answer, and actually probably not even for me.
So definitely something to explore more then, which is always a good thing. But thank you for trying to grasp all the question. And the second question, and obviously I think regarding also the time of our program, so then I think that will be the last question of tonight's program. So what I would like to know is actually if you are able to detect what was a specific period of time when the queer games started to emerge. In a way, if you are able kind of to link it and to connect it to some larger like social movements or some social phenomena which were emerging at the same time, or maybe some other content which emerged in a popular culture of films, TV series. Right. So do you see it as a part of a larger block of media content which kind of produced the change?
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think there are two answers to your question. First one is that what I was talking about is a wave of queer games that has started somewhere like in at the beginning of 2010s, and it was very much enabled to a large extent, even though there have been queer games before, obviously, and queer game creators, but have been enabled by three factors actually. The one was more and more accessible game development with a lot of new tools, with a lot of new engines, with a lot of new, for example, visual novel, like game making tools for like where you can create game without any coding or very little coding. Second was internet and digital distribution and the rise of like sort of community-based digital gaming platforms. One of the most important ones is .itch.io or itch.io, which is like a platform where everybody can put up their game and sell their game and like talk about their game, and like all of the games I talked about basically are on there. And the third thing is the so-called indie revolution that has happened in games in like 2008 roughly, which showed that you can actually create games by yourself or with a small team and be somewhat successful and like kind of penetrate the AAA monopolies in some ways, because you no longer have to create CDs, and you can like basically distribute your games online. But that's only a part of the question. That's only the part of the answer. That's like a more of a game industry like answer. The second answer would be that since those are all the games that have been created in 2010s onward, it's like specifically with the example of trance, rights and trans visibility, it is somewhat aligned with what was, and maybe too optimistically, called the transgender tipping point, with a lot of people coming out as trans, with Kendall Jenner coming out as trans, with Transparent TV show and a lot of quality TV actually dealing with transness in a very nuanced and cool way. Today we have Euphoria as a great example of trans TV show. So I think this is definitely happening on together with some sort of awareness happening in broader culture. We also have a lot of trans books at this point, I think. And so yeah, this definitely is part of a larger queering of the whole mediascape. But yeah, I think it's important with all those media forms and games as well, who tells those stories, if there are queer people involved in the creative process, and if they are adequately paid, right? So, but yeah, definitely it's been enhanced, I think, by those movements.
So thank you for highlighting the both aspects, the video game industry as well as the media landscape in general, but within the media landscape, mostly the production part, which I think that stays usually invisible to us as consumers, when we definitely don't think about who is standing behind the outcome and what are the opportunities for these people which are set to present themselves in active roles of social agents creating the content. So thanks for that. Okay, and this way we are actually finally reaching the end of the program. We are finalizing the examination of the queer as a social phenomenon, as well as research, creative and artistic strategies. I very much like that you've enjoyed all 3 contributions. Me personally, I find it really rich, and I hope that those who kind of were not able today to spend the evening with us, you will be able to find all the speakers and their presentations online on our website very soon, hopefully next week. All the stream will stay available immediately on the YouTube channel. So next month, specifically on the March the 30th, we are going to meet again. That time we will be talking in Czech, and we will be specifically discussing a very large topic and the issue image versus time, obraz versus čas. And I can just promise that the first speaker who will kind of more theoretically open the session for us will be an art critic, art historian, and a curator of contemporary art, Eva Skopelová. So hopefully you will enjoy the next month's program in a very same way how you enjoyed tonight's program, and stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected, not only with fresh eyes, but with everyone you like and care about. It's really important in these times. So have a good evening and be well. Good night.